Just yesterday, 80 people survived a plane crash at Toronto's Pearson Airport. We also have the story of a woman who survived in the jungle for 11 days after her plane was struck by lightning, and who has the Guinness World Record for the highest fall survived without a parachute. These are scary times people survived plane crashes. So this just happened yesterday. A flight from Minneapolis crashed at Toronto Pearson International Airport just after 2 p.m., flipping onto its back on landing. But miraculously, all 76 passengers and 4 crew members got out alive. Of course, there have been injuries though. The Greater Toronto Airports Authority, or GTAA, said 17 people were hurt, while Delta put the number at 18. Former Transportation Safety Board of Canada investigator David McNair said that the way the plane crashed may have been part of the reason there were no fatalities, saying the rolling impact, although uncomfortable and unpleasant, is not as bad as having a direct impact somewhere. John Graddick from McGill University also credited the firefighting team at Toronto Pearson, the pilots, and the aircraft manufacturer for the successful evacuation. Investigators from the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, with assistance from the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, are still looking into exactly what went wrong. So far, they haven't shared specifics, but Graddick is saying we should get a report within 30 days. My first thought was the weather had to do with it. We got hit with mounds of snow last week. McNair pointed out that the pilots were warned of a 17-knot crosswind just before landing. There were also reports of snow on the runway, despite Pearson crews clearing snow all weekend after back-to-back storms. Imagine being fresh out of high school, it's Christmas Eve, and you're flying over the vast Amazon rainforest with your mother. Well, that's where Juliane Koepcke found herself on December 24th of 1971, aboard Lanza Flight 508. The flight was supposed to be this routine trip from Lima to Pucallpa, Peru, but this trip was about to be anything but routine. The plane hit a severe thunderstorm, and then lightning struck the aircraft, and horrifyingly, it broke apart mid-air. Juliane, still strapped to her seat, plummeted about 10,000 feet into the jungle below, knowing full well that these were going to be her final moments. But then, miraculously, her eyes opened. She was alive, with nothing but a broken collarbone, a deep cut on her right arm, and a swollen eye. Drawing on survival skills that she'd learned from her parents, who were both zoologists, she got to work, setting out to make it back home alive. And for 11 grueling days, Juliane followed streams before she finally made it to civilization. Eventually, she came across a hut used by local lumberjacks who treated her wounds before transporting her to the hospital. And she's still here today. She went on to become a mammologist specializing in bats. On August 16th, 1987, Northwest Airlines Flight 255 took off from Detroit Metropolitan Airport bound for Phoenix. On board were 155 people, including a young girl named Cecelia Cichan and her family, her parents, Michael and Paula, and her brother David. Seconds after takeoff, something went horribly wrong. The plane failed to gain altitude properly, clipped a light pole, and crashed onto a nearby road, erupting into a fireball. Everyone on board was killed except Cecelia. Rescuers arriving at the scene, they weren't expecting to find any survivors. The wreckage was just a complete nightmare. But then they found her, Cecelia, alive, still strapped to her seat. She was severely injured with broken bones, burns, a fractured skull, but she was breathing. Some say she only survived because her mother shielded her in their final moments, but Cecelia herself has no memory of the crash. After months in the hospital, she was taken in by her aunt and uncle who shielded her from the public eye. She grew up privately, avoiding media attention for decades. It wasn't until 2013, in a documentary about sole survivors of plane crashes, that she briefly spoke out. On January 26, 1972, a Yugoslav Airlines DC-9 was flying over Czechoslovakia when it just exploded mid-air. The plane had been cruising at 33,000 feet when an explosive, allegedly planted by Croatian nationalists, blew it apart. All 28 passengers and crew were killed instantly, except for one. Vesna Vulović, a 22-year-old flight attendant, somehow survived the fall. Yeah, she fell 33,000 feet over 6 miles When rescuers found her, she was a mangled mess. Her legs were broken, her skull was fractured, and she had multiple crushed vertebrae, but she lived. She was in a coma for weeks, and when she woke up, she had no memory of the crash. Doctors think she only survived because she was trapped in the plane's tail section, which cushioned her fall as it slammed into a snowy forested hillside. Vesna went on to make a full recovery though, but she was never quite the same. She became a bit of a national hero in Yugoslavia, but she also got tangled in conspiracy theories, because of course she did. Some people claimed the plane wasn't actually that high when it exploded. Either way though, she still holds the Guinness World Record for the highest fall survived without a parachute. On June 30th, 2009, a young girl named Bahia Bakari was flying from Paris to Comoros with her mother when the flight, carrying 153 people, crashed into the Indian Ocean. The impact should have been unsurvivable, yet somehow Bahia lived. She was the only one. She didn't have a life vest even. She wasn't a trained swimmer. She was just a young girl who suddenly found herself floating in the open ocean, clinging to a piece of wreckage in total darkness. The waves were relentless, the water was freezing, and she had no idea what had just happened. She held on for 9 hours before fishermen spotted her and pulled her to safety. It was nothing short of a miracle. Investigators think she was thrown from the plane, still strapped to her seat, which may have absorbed some of the impact. But even surviving the crash wasn't enough. She had to endure hours alone in shark-infested water, injured and exhausted, until someone finally found her. When she was rescued, she was dehydrated, covered in bruises, and had a broken collarbone, but she was alive and is still alive and well today. On January 15th, 2009, US Airways Flight 1549 took off from LaGuardia Airport in New York, heading for Charlotte. Just 3 minutes into the flight, a flock of geese collided with the plane, taking out both engines. A commercial jet had now turned into a glider over one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Captain Chesley Sellenberger, or Sully as he was often called, and First Officer Jeff Skiles had to make a call fast. They didn't have enough altitude to make it back to LaGuardia, and trying for another airport could have ended in catastrophe. Sully made the call. Just ditch the plane in the Hudson River. Now, water landings aren't exactly a common practice. They don't usually end well, but Sully managed to bring the plane down in a near perfect glide, keeping it intact on impact. The passengers, who were told to brace for a crash, found themselves standing on the wings of a floating airplane waiting for rescue boats. All 155 people on board survived. The incident went on to be called the Miracle on Hudson, but in reality, it was the skill and quick thinking of the pilots that turned what could have been a major disaster into one of the most incredible aviation survival stories of all time. On October 13th, 1972, Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, carrying a rugby team, their friends and family, was en route to Chile when it crashed into the Andes Mountains. The plane had hit a peak, tearing off both wings and the tail before plummeting into a glacier. Of the 45 people on board, 29 survived the initial crash, but the crash itself would end up being the least nightmarish part. Now the survivors were stranded in the mountains with no food, it was freezing, and they were in the middle of nowhere. It was just a worst case scenario. Days turned into weeks, avalanches buried their makeshift shelter, and hope was starting to fade. They had to resort to drastic measures to stay alive, including eating the remains of some of the people who died. But eventually, two survivors, Nando Parado and Roberto Canesse, decided they needed to act. No one was coming for them. They decided they needed to head out in search of help, and what followed was an insane 10-day trek through the mountains with barely any gear. Against all odds though, they made it to civilization, leading rescuers back to the crash site. By the time help arrived, 16 people were still alive, having lasted 72 days in one of the most extreme survival situations imaginable. On April 4th, 1979, Trans World Airlines Flight 841 was cruising at 39,000 feet when something absolutely terrifying happened. The plane suddenly went into an uncontrollable dive. Within seconds, the Boeing 727 dropped 34,000 4,000 feet, spiraling towards the ground at an insane speed. Passengers were thrown around, oxygen masks were deployed, and for a brief moment, it seemed like no one was making it out alive. The pilots had no idea what was happening. Captain Hoot Gibson, a former Navy pilot, fought against the controls while First Officer Scott Kennedy and Flight Engineer Gary Banks desperately tried to stabilize this plane. The forces were so intense that the jet's wings started to bend and parts of the plane were torn off mid-air. At the last possible moment, the pilots managed to regain control at around 5,000 feet, narrowly avoiding total disaster. What caused it though? Officially, investigators blamed the crew, saying they accidentally extended the plane's flaps mid-flight, but Gibson always denied it, saying something else had happened, possibly a mechanical failure or even a cover-up. Whatever the truth is, the fact is TWA Flight 841 came horrifyingly close to becoming another aviation disaster, but amazingly, everyone survived. Imagine you're cruising at 41,000 feet when suddenly both engines die and it's just silence. Well, on July 23rd, 1983, Air Canada Flight 143 ran out of fuel mid-flight. Turns out a mix-up between metric and imperial measurements led to the plane getting only half the fuel it actually needed. So this Boeing 767 was now a very expensive, very heavy glider. Captain Bob Pearson and First Officer Maurice Quintal had to figure something out. With no power, they had no thrust, no hydraulics, and barely any control. Quintal suggested an old airbase at Gimli, Manitoba. What they didn't know was that that airstrip had been turned into a drag racing track. With no time to find another option, Pearson brought the plane in on a dead stick landing, meaning no engines, no power, just pure piloting skill. They touched down, but they touched down hard, blowing out the front landing gear and skidding to a stop just short of where people were hanging out near the track. Miraculously, nobody died. Not even the plane. The passengers walked away, and the aircraft itself was later repaired and put back into service. On August 2nd, 2005, Air France Flight 358 was trying to land in Toronto during a severe thunderstorm. Visibility was awful. Wind gusts were brutal, and the runway was soaked. It ended up touching down way too far down the runway, and by the time the pilots hit the brakes, it was too late. The plane skidded off the pavement, crashed through barriers, and plowed straight into a ravine. The impact tore the plane apart, and fire erupted immediately. Inside, smoke filled the cabin as passengers scrambled to get out. It was every traveler's worst nightmare. But somehow, every single person on board, which was 309 people, mind you, made it out alive before the flames engulfed the plane entirely. The evacuation was pure chaos though. Some passengers were just frozen in terror, others pushed and shoved, but the crew managed to get everyone out in under 90 seconds. Later, investigators found that the pilots had misjudged the landing distance and should have gone around instead of forcing the plane down in dangerous conditions. While the crash could have been a major tragedy though, the fact that every single person survived made it one of the most incredible aviation escape stories ever. Was the wreckage a fiery mess? Yes, but the passengers shaken but alive. With all that said, I've been your host James, and I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.